Hello! Let's talk about jQuery UI interactions. So this is the category of widgets, as they call them in jQuery UI, that allow us to insert really typical kinds of user interactions into our web page. Most prominently, dragging elements around, dropping them onto other elements and getting some kind of a result. There's also resizing and a couple of other features that are interesting. What I want to do in this particular video is focus in on really the classic, which is drag and drop, and how we can use those maybe a little more creatively than, for example, dragging files into a trash can or something like that. Although dragging files into a trash can is a great metaphor for many things, so that could be fun too. So let us begin. How are we going to do this? Well, as always, we need a project to work on right now. So let's begin from scratch by creating an HTML project that we can actually do some work in. So I'm going to go over to my, I feel a bit distracted by seeing my face there. I'm going to go to my cart263 repository, and I'm going to go into topics. What am I doing here? I'm going to create a jQuery UI folder. And I'm actually going to maintain the same project across the videos where I'm talking about jQuery UI. So I'll build my project actually directly inside this jQuery UI folder here. As we know, in order to work on this project, I should open the folder in Atom. So I'll drag that onto my Atom here. And it's empty. So what do we begin with? Well, the first thing that we need is probably our index.html. So I'm going to create a new file called index.html. Very creative of me. In the notes for this video, I've got some simple HTML that we can just paste in here. So let me paste that in. I'm going to close it and reopen it so we get the highlighting. Don't know why Atom has decided to start doing that. So as you can see, pretty basic, just a complete skeleton of an HTML page. It does have a reference to style.css in the CSS folder, so let me create that while I'm here. New folder, CSS. And inside the CSS, a new file called style.css. We will be using a little bit of CSS just to make things look a tiny bit more interesting. So that is important to create. And then the final thing that I refer to here in this template HTML is my script.js. So I need to create my folder called JS for JavaScript. And in that, I need to create my file script.js. And I'll open that up as well. So now we've got the big three of a web project. We've got our basic HTML file, we've got a script, and we've got a style file for our CSS. So we're ready to make a web page. I guess I'll get it running in the meantime as well. So let me start the server for that. Let me just check what I've got going on over here. Oh, so I've got the jQuery UI page open as well. So let me run the server so we can take a look at nothing, because there's nothing there. So what do we need to do to actually make our project work? Well, we know that we need a couple of things, right? We know that, because we've discussed it already, that we need jQuery, standard jQuery. And where I'm going to get that from is from code.jquery.com. Which is the CDN, Content Delivery Network, for jQuery. So we need jQuery core. It's now at version 3.6. Obviously that changes over time. The changes are not usually so major that it matters. And I'm going to grab the minified version of jQuery core. So I click there. It gives me this script tag. I'm going to copy its nice little copy icon there. And I'm going to put that into my index.html. Where do I put it? I'm going to put it in the little library script section of my head element. So there we go. So there is jQuery. Now we've got jQuery, which is good because we need it. What else do we need? We need jQuery UI. So let's scroll down a little bit. Here's jQuery UI, the section about jQuery UI here. And again, I'm going to grab the minified version of the latest version of jQuery UI, which is 1.12.1. So I'm going to click here. I get another script tag, which is very convenient. I copy it, I switch back to my program, and I paste it in. So now I've got jQuery and jQuery UI. Because jQuery UI relies on jQuery, I'm putting the script tag in after I've already included jQuery. There's an assumption made that jQuery UI is assuming that jQuery is available, so we should put it after it. That's just a standard practice. Now we're not finished, right? Because the other thing we know that we need when we're using jQuery UI is some CSS. And to obtain that CSS, the easiest thing is to just choose one of these themes here. Chalk, Mint Chalk, or Pepper Grinder, or as I'm going to boringly choose, Base. When we click on this, we end up with the actual file itself, which is pretty giant. So what we can do is we can take the URL up here and copy it. I'm going to copy it with Command C. On Windows, that would be Control C. I'm going to copy that, and I'm going to create a link element at the top here. I'm going to put it relative to my CSS. I'll put it before my CSS, and I'm going to create the same kind of thing that we're using to include my own, which is these little bits and pieces. I probably should have just copied it. That would have been a bit easier. And in this href, that's where I'm going to paste the URL that points to that core CSS, base CSS. Okay. So now we've got the style sheet, we've got our own style sheet, we've got jQuery, and we've got jQuery UI, and we've got our script. So we've got all of the moving pieces that we need in order to actually start working with jQuery UI. So let us begin. So the first thing that I want to look at is I want to look at the draggable demo. And I want to use that. So I'm just going to close these windows now that we don't need them anymore. Close and close. So again, I'm on the home page of jQueryui.com. I'm going to click through to draggable here because this is the effect that I want. And we already looked at this in the introductory video, but this is what allows us to drag things. I'm also going to open my view source to remind myself of how I do that. And we need to target an element using jQuery, and then we use this .draggable method in order to be able to drag it. So in order to do that, I'm going to need some stuff in my actual program over here. In particular, I definitely am going to need some HTML because otherwise there are no elements that I can do anything with. So let's go ahead and do that. I've got in the notes some nice, simple HTML that we can paste in. So I'm going to paste it in right here in the body. Paste. I really wish that the indentation worked a little bit better, but what I'm going to do basically is I'm going to have a prisoner. I should say, I'm kind of interested in creating this as an example, is going to be a prisoner in a prison trying to escape. Which drag and drop kind of makes sense to me as an example. It's obviously not the standard, but I think this will be fun. So we've got a span which represents a prisoner. We're going to be able to drag this prisoner around to kind of help them escape. And then they're inside, great metaphor, a div which has an ID of prison. That's going to be the thing that's containing them that they're trying to escape from, right? If we look at this right now, it's going to look underwhelming. Oh, I need to actually open it up. I forgot. I think I closed it by mistake even because I'm not too sharp. I think it's because I called this jQuery UI. I'm going to call it the prisoner. That will help me identify the correct tab. Okay, so let me start this up again. Oh, good grief. It's opened in another window. Let me just drag it down over here. There we go. So it doesn't look very good. The prisoner is there. It's inside a div, but the div is not really visible because divs aren't visible by default. So we just end up with this thing that just says the prisoner on it. Underwhelming. What do we need to make this look more like my dream of a prisoner inside a prison? We need some CSS, right, to affect the visual style. And the CSS that I'm going to use is also in the notes. So I'm just going to paste it in. I'll quickly touch on what it's doing. So we're selecting the prison, which is the containing element. We're giving it some dimensions so that it actually occupies space on the web page. I'm using this VW or view width. What's it called? Unit. Good grief. So that it's like 30% of the width of the window. Jeepers creepers. And I'm going to give it a boundary, right? This is important so that we can see it. So it's got a border that is 5 pixels thick. It's a dashed line and it is in black. That will enable us to see the prison, so it looks a bit prison-y. And now I've just included a little bit of CSS grid here to align things inside the prison, aka the prisoner, so that they're in the center of the prison. The prisoner themselves, all I'm doing is increasing their font size so that they're a little bit easier to see. So if we head back over, we get a prison with a prisoner in it. Much, much better. Much, much more like something we can work with here. And if as we were discussing, right, if I scale the window, because I'm using that VW unit, it scales on its own. I should probably scale the font size at the same time to make that work. But I'm not going to do that because that will lead me down a road. So right now, this looks good. It's a great kind of demonstration of a prisoner in a prison, but we can't do anything. And the whole idea is, let's make this prisoner draggable. Then they can escape the prison. So let us begin. Back over here, we know from looking at this initial, most basic demo that to make something draggable, we select it with jQuery and we call the draggable method on it. So let's do that with this prisoner over here. The prisoner has an ID of hash prisoner, an ID of prisoner. So let's select that, select the prisoner, and make it draggable by just using this draggable method. Be draggable, prisoner. That's it. That's what it takes. Now the prisoner is draggable, and the prisoner has escaped. Off you go, prisoner. Run, run, run for your life. He's running, or they are running, I should say. Oh, good. So they escaped, and the prison is empty. So it's draggable, and instantly we have an actual interactive experience that kind of makes a little bit of sense. We could also make the prison draggable, of course, if we wanted to. Just target the prison and make that draggable. Makes less sense. The prison is now draggable. Notice that because the prisoner is inside the prison as an HTML element in the hierarchy, the prisoner moves as well, because we're dragging everything inside the prison. This applies weirdly too, like it feels weird, but if I drag the prisoner out of the prison and I move the prison, they still move because this element is still in the hierarchy of the HTML underneath. It's still inside the prison. And so this raises a sort of an interesting question about whether this prisoner has really escaped the prison, right? If the prison is still kind of attached to it. That's getting deep. Okay, so I don't think dragging the prison makes much sense in our metaphor of escaping from prison, so I'm going to remove that from my script, and let's carry on. Now, let's go back to our draggable demos, and let's learn a little bit more about what's possible. Because as we can see here, there's a bunch of stuff that's going on. There's a bunch of more specific examples of making things draggable that I think are worth looking at. We're not going to look at all of them, but since we're talking about prison, constrained movement seems like a relevant category. So let's click on that. Now, jQuery UI, their examples tend to be pretty staid, like they're not trying to amaze you with their creativity, and nor should they be, because they're trying to just show you how things work. So this thing says I can only be dragged horizontally, and indeed, if I drag this, no matter where my mouse goes, it only sits on this x-axis, right? That's pretty cool. And likewise, we can do the same thing here with this y-axis here. So we can constrain movement on an axis, and it seems neat. Like I would like to be able to do that. What if we wanted our prisoner to only be able to kind of pace back and forth, right? So they should only be able to kind of like do this. Then we would want to achieve this trick here. So how are they doing this trick? Again, we could go and look at the API right now and find out, but because these demos are quite nicely done, we can also just go down here and look inside this funny little function. There's 4 things being done in here, and that's because there are 4 elements up here in the example that are doing different things. But luckily, it's kind of straightforward to work out which is which. We target the thing that we're making draggable, we use the draggable method, but now we provide some options inside an object. So you can see we've got these curly brackets. That means that it's an object, and then we've got a property name. That's the thing that we're going to set on this draggable thing that we're creating. And there's a property called axis, and then we provide a string that says which axis. So in this case, the axis is the x-axis. So we can do that with our prisoner, right? Let's go and do that. So draggable, we're going to add an options object inside it. I prefer to do this on a new line. I think it looks clearer. and we're going to set the axis property to the letter X, which is specifying the prisoner is draggable, but only on the X-axis. Let's go and make sure that that works. So here's the prisoner, and indeed now they can only paste back and forth in their cell, pacing, 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 pacing. But they can also pace out of their cell, which is still kind of trippy. And that's probably something that we want to fix, right? If this is going to be a prison, it shouldn't be that easy to escape, presumably. So that might put us on a road to thinking about, well, how can we keep the prisoner inside the prison? And jQuery UI does have an option for this. And in fact, it's another part of this constrain movement thing, right? If we look at the demo, I'm contained within the box. This element here that I'm dragging around can't get outside its container, okay? That's what we want to do with the prison, right? Like, it's like this thing is the prisoner and the box is the prison. That's the effect that we would probably want, is that the prisoner can't get out, if we're thinking in terms of being a prison warden for the moment. So how did they do that? Presumably it's this third one, right? Just in terms of counting. So the key thing that we see here is that they've got a thing called containment. Okay, so containment, they write containment, that's the option, and then the thing that they set containment to is a selector, a CSS selector. And we can probably guess that what that's saying is specify the element on the page that it's being contained in. So we can either do that with a CSS selector here, or if we want to, we can just say it's contained by its parent. And that would be the next thing up in the hierarchy. Both of these would work for the prison because the prison is the parent of the prisoner. That's getting even, there's some deep philosophy there. I'm sure that Foucault would be into that idea. So we can either say parent, or we can select the prison by its ID. So the main thing is we want that containment option. So let's add that. Let's keep the axis, and we're going to add a containment option here. And I'm going to specify, I'm going to do it by ID because I feel like there's some clarity of programming here to say, the containment is the prison. That just looks kind of helpful to me in terms of explaining what's going on. So the prisoner is draggable on the x-axis, and it's contained within the prison. So this should mean that when we go back to the prisoner over here, they're constrained on this axis, and now they can't get out. This kind of makes me want to remove the axis because I think it'll be more dramatic if they can't get out a little bit more thoroughly in all axes. So I'm going to delete this option, comme ça. And now we just have a thing where it's contained within the prison. So no matter where I drag it, it can be dragged. So the prisoner can move around and thrash and shout, but they cannot get outside the div that is their prison. It's pretty dark. Maybe I shouldn't have done this, but I think it's a pretty interesting thing that we can do here. Okay, so there's a lot more to look at. I'm not going to go through every single conceivable feature, right, that's available for this draggable. I just want us to look at the basics. The other one I want us to definitely look at, though, is this idea of events, because that's kind of important. Events are, as we know, such a big part of programming in JavaScript for the browser. This whole idea of event-driven programming is very big. So we should at least know what the events are. So here's a nice boring example. You can see that there are 3 events here. There's a start event that's been invoked once, the moment I started dragging. There's a drag event that's being invoked a lot. Basically every time I move the mouse, it's, I guess roughly speaking, once per frame, once per update. It's calling this drag handler. And then there's a stop, which hasn't been invoked yet because I haven't actually stopped dragging this element. I haven't let go. So as soon as I let go, stop gets invoked, right? So those are the big 3 that are available. Again, we would like to know how that is done. So we go and look down here in the source code. And here this is a good example of it getting just a teensy bit less clear, I would argue. So how is this working? There's quite a lot of code going on because they've got this whole interface thing that they're implementing. I don't know if this is the best way for them to have written this example, but whatever. Let's try and cut through to just the bit that we care about, and that's just going to be this draggable method again, right? That's where all of the action is when we create this thing that's draggable, which is what we're doing here. There are more options that we can provide, and there's basically, we can provide an option named after the event that we want to deal with, such as the start event, something to do when this dragging begins. And as I think you might expect, as a person who knows about event-driven programming, we provide a function here. Here they've got an anonymous function. And that function can do something when dragging starts, right? So we would like probably to be able to do that. So let's go ahead and do that over here. So we've got start and we've got stop. Let's just add a simple UI kind of nicety, which is that we'll say that when it starts, so we're going to create the start option, the start event, and we're going to provide a function. And what are we going to do when it starts? We're going to style the prisoner just to add an underline. So I'm going to use the CSS method from jQuery, and I'm going to set the text decoration property, and I'm going to set it to underline, so that when dragging begins, the prisoner gets an underline. So let's make sure that that works before we carry on too far. So I click and start dragging, and now the prisoner has an underline, right? So it's like a little bit of user interface emphasis. But when I let go, the underline is still there, which kind of undoes that. So I also would like to handle the stop event. So I'm going to add another option to this list, which is stop, and I'm going to undo that action, right? I'm going to say target the prisoner and set their CSS of text decoration to none, which is removing the underline. Okay, so when it starts, we add an underline. When it stops, we remove that underline. So we get this effect where while I'm dragging, it's underlined, and when I let go, it stops. It's just a nice little indication that something's happening, right? I'm not saying it's amazing. Now, you may remember from jQuery that targeting the prisoner explicitly here is not the world's best thing to do because it limits our possibilities. We might want this to be a little bit more generic. And just as in jQuery, when we're talking about an event like this, we can use this to refer to the thing that was affected by the event. So because the prisoner is the thing that's starting to be dragged and stopping being dragged, this, in this context, refers to the prisoner. And this is a much more common way of writing that. So same effect. Gets an underline when we start dragging, loses it when we stop. So that's a nice simple usage of start and stop. Okay, and that's where I'm going to stop talking about these demos of Draggable. There's quite a few more, and it's really worth just looking at all of them and getting a sense of what's available to you. There's some pretty interesting stuff around reverting, for example, or snapping to a grid. Those are super cool things that you might want to do. There's dragging and sorting. So there's a whole lot of stuff. It's really worth going through every example and just getting some knowledge of like what are the sort of categories of what you can do. But what I want to do now, because we've kind of like exhausted the basic idea of how these demos work, is I do want to take a look at the API for the Draggable, just to talk a little bit about how it's structured and how we read it. Okay, so let's do that by scrolling all the way to the bottom. And want to learn more about the Draggable interaction? Check out the API documentation. I think I will. So let's open the API over here. I've opened it in a new tab. So here's the API for the Draggable widget. So let's just quickly look at the components here. It's a very long page, as you can see from this scroll bar. So we're not going to read the whole thing. I just want to look at the components of this here. So this is what it's about. It's about the Draggable widget, which is in essence that method, right? The Draggable method and what we can do with it that we've been seeing in the demos. The main thing, and obviously we've got a description of what it does. I think we're pretty familiar. Allow elements to be moved using the mouse via dragging. That is exactly what we do. And then the first thing we see is this quick nav. This is useful to us obviously more once we know what's going on down below. But this does actually tell us important information. So we can see that there's three categories of things that we can care about here. The first one is options. These are things that we can set on a draggable element to kind of influence how it works, right? And we've already seen, for example, we've played with axis, which is one of these ones here. We've played with containment over here as well. And you can see that there's a whole bunch that might be interesting. Revert, opacity, helper, grid. There's a whole bunch of stuff that seems like it could be pretty fun to play with. And all of these have documentation down below, which we'll look at. The second category we have here is methods. And this just gives us the ability to kind of affect a draggable element during its lifetime in our program. So not at the moment of creation, but maybe later on. So for example, we might want to disable something from being draggable for a bit and then enable it, so we can do that. And we might want to set an option to something else, we can do that. So these are things where we can affect a draggable thing while our program is running. And then the final category are the events, which we just looked at, right? Drag, we saw start and stop. We've actually used start and stop already. And there's also one called create, which is presumably the event called when a draggable gets created. So those are the three categories. All of these are documented. And so we will take a quick look at these, but let's scroll down just a touch more. There's a little bit of extra information here. Make the selected elements draggable by mouse. If you want not just drag, but drag and drop, see the jQuery UI Droppable plugin. And we will take a look at that in a moment, okay? I just want to point this out. There's a little bit of information about the CSS involved in this dragging widget. If you want to get really down into things and want to be able to style how things being dragged look, you can see that there's a UI draggable class that gets added to draggable elements when they're made draggable, and there's also a UI draggable disabled class that's added when dragging is disabled. While they're being dragged, they have a UI draggable dragging class, and if they have a handle, which is one of the options that you can set, there's a UI draggable handle class. So there's all of these extra classes that are used on elements that you can use to really specifically style things coming out of jQuery UI if you want to. This is not something I do a lot of myself, but it's really worth knowing that they give this theming information if you need it. If we scroll down, we just immediately get to the options category. So what I would like to do then is let's look at one that we're a bit more familiar with. So I'm going to go back up and I'm going to click through to the axis option, because we already know what it does, so this will make it a little easier to read, right? So for all of these options, we get the same basic information, right? So there's the name of the property, which we know, axis. The type here is like, what can you set it to? What kind of thing can you set it to? And that's a string, right? We know that it was a string that contained X or a string that contained Y. The default value, what is it set to by default? False, i.e. there's no constraints on either axis. We get a description, constrains dragging to either the horizontal X or vertical Y axis. Possible values are X and Y. So that tells us what we can set it to. And that's it. That's all they really give us in terms of what this axis thing does. And that's, it's kind of because it is that simple. It's not a rocket science kind of option that we're talking about. The other helpful thing, of course, is code snippets, right? So we have here exactly how we used it before. You select the thing, you call the draggable method, and then inside the options object, you set axis to X. That's what we did. Also worth knowing, though, that we can, if we want to, change the draggable's axis later on. This is one of those methods that we were talking about just before. So we can say select a thing that's draggable, and instead of making it draggable, what we're doing here is we're saying use the option method to set the axis property or option to this X. So we could, for example, at a certain point in a program, have something that sort of initially you can drag it anywhere, but then at a certain point, if we use this line, for example, it suddenly becomes only draggable on the horizontal axis. So it's just useful because you might want to change how a draggable thing works during your program, right? So good to know. So that's how options work. Again, I'm not going to read all of them. There's a lot of documentation there. They all function in the same way, though, right? That's how the documentation for options works. So what are the methods? Well, we just actually saw the option method. We use that to set these options down here at later points in the lifetime of our program. A useful one that we may end up wanting to use is disable. So let's look at the disable method as an example here. So how do we call it? Like this. What does it do? It disables the draggable element, right? So you select it and you say draggable disable in a string, and that will cause it to stop being draggable. But of course you can re-enable it by using the enable. They call these methods, but I think it's a little bit confusing that they call them that. At any rate, you say draggable and then enable to re-enable one that's been disabled. So we could add this to our program. Let's just to make sure that we understand how this thing is working. So for example, we could, so the thing is draggable, right? It's contained within the prison. We could, if we wanted to, let's set a timer. So we'll set a timeout, and we're going to make the prisoner not draggable after, what, 5 seconds. So we've got a timeout. It's going to call this function in 5 seconds, and we're going to say target the prisoner after 5 seconds. And we're using the draggable method not to make it draggable, but to call one of its special draggable methods, which is the disable method. We write it in a string, remember that. So after 5 seconds, this is going to disable the draggable nature of the prisoner. So you only kind of get like a brief period where you're able to drag the prisoner around. So I reload it, I can drag the prisoner, I can drag the prisoner, I can drag the prisoner, I can drag the prisoner. I can no longer drag the prisoner because that disable has been called, and now the prisoner is stuck. Even more a prisoner than they were before, okay? So that's the idea of methods, right? Is that at some point in your program, you might want to change how a draggable element is working. And then the final element that we're already fairly familiar with, if I scroll back up to the top here, are the events, right? So we had start and stop we've already used. So let's go and look at start as an example. Triggered when dragging starts. This does tell us one extra thing, which is kind of useful, or a couple of extra things actually. One of those things is we can see that we could be accepting parameters in the function that gets called with a start, one called event and one called UI. You can see it kind of demoed here, maybe a little better actually. So we create a draggable and we set the start option to a function, and that takes 2 parameters by default, event and UI. So maybe I should go and update my code over here because we had them blank because we weren't using them. But it always makes sense to include them, I think, anyway, to remind yourself that they're available. So we get an event parameter that's got information about the event, and a UI parameter which is specific to jQuery UI, which has got information about the UI elements involved in this process, which we will use a little bit later on. Okay, the other thing that we might notice if we care is that you can also add these listeners, because ultimately what start and stop are is event listeners, right? You can add them using the standard jQuery syntax of saying on, and then the name of the event, you can see it's called drag start, one word, not just called start, but drag start, because they have to distinguish it. And then the same thing, you provide a function to be called when that event occurs. That's just if you want to add your events on in this particular style. It also enables you to add events, listeners to your draggable elements later on in your program again, right? It doesn't have to be when you create the draggable thing. You can also listen for them later on as desired. So that's quite a lot of information, but the good thing is that is the 3 categories of this API documentation of the draggable widget, options, methods, and events. And even better, all of the jQuery UI widgets, whether it's droppable or a dialog box or a specific effect, they all effectively have the same kind of documentation. They either have documentation that's the same as jQuery's documentation, or if they're a widget kind of a thing, then they have this kind of documentation. So in looking at that in a little bit of detail, we kind of got coverage on how to read jQuery UI documentation, which is nice. I want to cap this off by quickly looking at a different interaction. You know, as jQuery UI itself says, like it's very, very common to pair dragging something with dropping it somewhere and having that have significance. So I want to look at the droppable as well. So what can droppable do? It's very kind of self-explanatory. We have a thing that we can drag. This thing is draggable, we know. And if I drop it into this element here, that helpfully says drop here, like this is Alice in Wonderland or something, and I drop, you can tell that the thing here can tell that we dropped the element on it, right? It's changed to yellow and it says dropped. So it reacted to the dropping, to the dragging and the dropping. And that is something that we definitely might want to do, and it would enable us to make our prison simulation maybe a little bit more interesting. So we could respond to dragging the prisoner somewhere specific. And this makes me think of an escape tunnel. So I want to add an escape tunnel to the cell that we could drag the prisoner in so that they can actually escape. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's add the escape tunnel first, and then we'll look at how to actually get the code working. So I'm going to add an escape tunnel above the prisoner. Doesn't really matter where I do it. ID equals escape tunnel. It's just another span. I'm just going to use words, right? I'm going to say an escape tunnel. So there we go. There's an escape tunnel. If I head over to my page now, there's an escape tunnel above the prisoner. It doesn't look very much like an escape tunnel. I suppose that this doesn't look very much like a prisoner, so maybe that's okay. But I would like to style the escape tunnel to look like a tunnel. That will make me happy. I've got the CSS for this, again, in the notes, so feel free to go and look at those. And I'll just quickly talk about what's going on here. Again, we want some dimensions for this element so that we can actually see that it looks tunnely, that it has some kind of, it takes up some space. I want to give it an outline again so that it is visible against the white of the background. And border radius is a fun CSS property. It enables you to kind of set the rounding of all of the square elements on the page. Everything's a rectangle, right? If you set border radius to 100%, the thing becomes sort of an oval or a circle, depending on its dimensions. And then finally, this is just to align the text inside this element so that it's centered. So if I save that and I head back, now the escape tunnel, it looks okay. It could be better. It's a little bit, maybe I'm just going to change the word to just tunnel. I feel like that's just going to make me happier. There we go. That's better. Tunnel. I don't want to get too fidgety about CSS because that's not really what we're talking about. So what we want now is to be able to drag our prisoner into this tunnel. I'm remembering that we disabled dragging after 5 seconds, which is probably kind of annoying at this point. So I'm going to remove that right now. So if I remove that timeout that made it disabled dragging, then we get this idea of like, we've got the prisoner and I want to be able to kind of drag them onto the tunnel and then they escape. That's what I want to happen. And that's good. That's very much in line with this idea of dragging and dropping, right? We want the tunnel to respond to having the prisoner drag on it. And what do we want to do when that happens? We want the prisoner to escape. So let's look at how to do that. So now that we've got our thing in place, let's go look at the demo. I'll just reload the page quickly. So we know that the idea is you pick something up, you drag it onto an element, and you drop it, and hey presto, a thing happens. For us, that's going to be escaping prison. So how are they achieving that? Again, jQuery UI is pretty fantastic in its simplicity. So here we can see the draggable element. That's our prisoner in our example. That's just using a standard draggable, nothing special going on. The thing that we're dropping it onto, which has an ID of droppable, is using, as I think you might expect, a method called droppable to make it something that can respond to a dragged element that's dropped onto it. And as you might expect, it's got an options object inside it that we use to set up particular aspects of how the droppable widget works. And again, documentation, etc., is the same style. And you can see that they're just using one option, which is called drop. And we can probably guess, especially looking at this function here, this function signature that takes an event and a UI, that this is an event listener, right? And it's listening for when the drop event happens, i.e., when you drag something onto this element and drop it, this function here is going to be called. And what do they do? Well, they do some stuff, right? They add a class and they change the text inside the element. Importantly here, you can see that this here is referring not to the thing that was dragged onto it, but to the droppable element. And that kind of makes sense. That's the primary element in a droppable, right? Is the thing that you drop things onto. So this refers to the droppable. That would be the tunnel in our example. But let's at least add this idea of a droppable in. So let's head over here and let's select the escape tunnel, which I believe has an ID of escape tunnel, and let's make it droppable. Now, if we just make it droppable, it's kind of pointless because nothing's going to happen, right? If we go and look at it, I can drag the prisoner onto it, but there's no response because we haven't written a response. So droppable without any options, it's a little bit pointless, a little bit kind of imaginary. So we do want to add an options object, which we do in a JavaScript literal object like usual. And we know that we can provide a drop option that will call a function that takes parameters event and UI that will be called when we drop something onto it. So now we're really getting somewhere, right? And let's just do a console.log that just says dropped so that we know that it works, right? So when something gets dropped on the escape tunnel, we'll see the message dropped. Let's go and make sure that that's working. Bring up my console over here, and I drag the prisoner onto the tunnel, and I let go, and over here it says dropped. So it works. So the droppable does something. We want to do something, right? We don't want to just say dropped in the console. Nobody's going to be very excited about that. So what would we do? It makes sense to remove the prisoner from the page. I think that, to me, that's the sort of the most appropriate metaphorical idea, is that the only true escape is to leave the HTML entirely. Sorry, not prison.remove, although that is quite meta. I'm going to say prisoner.remove. So we'll target the prisoner when they get dropped on the escape tunnel, and we'll remove them from the page. That's the only way that they can get free of the prison in a true sense, right? So let's go and do that. Let's go and make sure that that works. So I get the prisoner, I drag them onto the tunnel, and they vanish. And the tunnel moves because of the CSS grid stuff. I'm not going to try and fix that. That's a real rabbit hole I don't want to go down. An escape tunnel I don't want to go down. So we've got like the effect I think that we want, which is you can drag the prisoner onto the tunnel, you drop, and it removes the prisoner from the HTML. They're gone. They have truly escaped. However, hopefully you're thinking, oh, it's not great though that you're assuming that it was the prisoner element that was dropped onto the tunnel. Like what if we had other elements in the program and we dragged one of them onto the tunnel? We don't want to always necessarily remove the prisoner. What if there were two prisoners and we don't know which one it is in that case? And so you're searching for like, how do you remove the prisoner? And you remember that you can say this inside things to kind of affect the element that was just affected. You can say this.remove. But if we do that, and I drag the prisoner on, the tunnel disappears because the tunnel is the this in this context because it is the droppable. So it's the thing that's most affected by the drop event listener, right? So we're talking about something being dropped. This refers to the droppable element, which makes sense because we're inside the droppable method, right? So how do we get a reference to the thing that was dropped? I mean, I know, obviously, but if we want a reference to the thing that was dropped, let's go look at the documentation for the drop method, I think. Let's go and have a look. So let's go to the API documentation, clicking at the bottom of the page there. And let's go to the events, right? Because these are the events here. And let's go to the drop event, which is here. And here we get the helpful information, if we can read this, and let's read it, is that it's telling us about what's inside these two parameters, right? Event and UI. So the event parameter has just got standard event information. I would hazard a guess that it's kind of like the mouse event information, less interesting to us right now. But the UI parameter has got at least one super useful thing. And the super useful thing is this draggable property of the UI parameter. So UI.draggable gives us this thing. And what is it? It's a jQuery object representing the draggable element. And that's what we want, right? Because that's the thing that is being dropped onto our droppable. So we can get a reference to the thing being dropped with UI.draggable. So let's do that to refer to the prisoner. Importantly, because UI.draggable is already a jQuery object, which it said it was, we don't need to select it using jQuery, right? We don't need the jQuery selection around this because UI.draggable is a jQuery element, and therefore we can just call the remove method on it straight away. So now, whatever got dropped onto our escape tunnel, whether it's the prisoner or something else, that is the thing that will be removed. So we get the same effect, right? If we go back to the program here and I drag the prisoner on, the prisoner disappears. But now if I had multiple prisoners, I could drag them on individually and each one would disappear individually as well. So it's just a better way of programming that interaction, right? And so here with like a teeny amount of code and some HTML and some CSS, we've got this quite sophisticated interactive web page, right? That's doing a lot. And as programmers, we know how hard it would be to implement all of that stuff ourselves. So jQuery UI is it really packs a punch. If you want to do the kinds of things that it can do, it is a great way to accomplish all kinds of goals. And of course, don't forget that We've only talked about draggable and droppable, but there's also resizable, there's selectable, and there's sortable. And they all, they work in similar ways, and the documentation works in similar ways. So do explore all of your options. That is where I'm going to leave it with jQuery UI interactions. I'll see you in the next video. I hope you are enjoying this exciting prison simulation. Bye.